Yes, sure. Yeah, hi, Edward Ogden. I'm an addiction medicine specialist. I split my time between the Austin, Hamilton Centre and Goulburn Valley Health. And my glorious professional title comes from the work I do at Swinburne. Okay, so today I'm going to fairly rapidly talk about some of the interesting vegetable material that people use to change their mental state. And I'm not going to talk about tobacco and betel nuts. So substances which are currently seen as being harmful haven't always been seen that way. There's the classic, more doctors smoke Camels than other cigarettes. And of course, cocaine was available in toothache drops. Opium was available in over-the-counter preparations well into the first part of last century. So things which are seen as harmful haven't always been seen that way. And there are always new opportunities for people to play with their brain. So I really have to start by talking about cannabis, which has been known throughout recorded history. It was really only discovered by the Western world in the middle of the 19th century. And the isolation of the cannabinoids really occurred in the early 90s and is still ongoing. Depending on who you talk to, there are 120 odd cannabinoids in the plant which are found in no other plant. And I really don't want to talk about cannabis in this talk, except that it's become an industrial issue. The production is truly staggering. I've had the pleasure of visiting a cannabis production facility in Canada, and it is kind of that size, and there are rows of those sorts of tunnels connected to each other. In Australia, the rise of medicinal cannabis has been really extraordinary. Once the TGA sort of opened the floodgates in 2016, it's been exponential. Whether there's any evidence that there's been any exponential benefit to health is, of course, absent. And there has certainly been an increase in presentations with cannabis-related mental illness. And hyperemesis is a problem in emergency departments. From a forensic point of view, there are lots of people who get a single prescription so that when they get caught driving or in the workplace, they can wave a prescription around and say, look, I've got a prescription. Not a topic I want to discuss at this time, but I'll take questions later. So the stimulants. The most ubiquitous one, of course, is caffeine, one of the most consumed drugs in the world. And it clearly is a drug. People develop tolerance, there is true dependence, and there is a true withdrawal syndrome. Not that many of us get asked to manage caffeine withdrawal, but it's a real thing. If you want to increase your knowledge of caffeine, tea and coffee, Michael Pollan has a great little audio book on the history of caffeine. And again, if we're talking about stimulants, can't really avoid cocaine. Huge international business. The UN still puts huge numbers on the value of cocaine moving around the world, in spite of the fact that the US tries to blow up some of their transports. And the size of the business is I find is always underlined by the fact that Pablo Escobar used to run out of rubber bands to put around his rolls of money. But many of you will be surprised to know that there is an Australian tree which also produces cocaine, or at least a very similar alkaloid. It's a native in Queensland and the Northern Territory, but because it contains cocaine-like alkaloids, it's actually illegal to grow it in New South Wales. So the tree has to respect the border. And there are lots of these stupidities around. I'll show you a few others. Many of you will have seen one of the angel's trumpets in people's gardens as a decorative plant. Brugmansia is the down-facing trumpet, and Datura species are the up-facing trumpets. All parts of the plant contain scopolamine and hyoscine, and are used occasionally by people to get some sort of cheap high. It's not usually described as being a nice thing to do. People who get a big dose are often terrified. But both plants are widely available, and you'll see them as garden ornamentals. They're perfectly legal to grow, but you're not allowed to distill things from them. It is a real issue. I had a forensic experience some years ago where a gentleman of ill repute had poisoned a number of teenage boys with a tea brewed from Brugmansia, and they were lying about the garden and the house in states of altered consciousness. I guess we all know a little bit about ephedra. Ephedra grows particularly in the hills of India as a wildflower, and from ephedra we of course get ephedrine, and from ephedrine you can make all of the amphetamines. And it is said that one of the limiting factors in the amphetamine trade is the availability of ephedra. You'll hear occasionally that the police have successfully knocked over a little backyard lab that's capable of producing half a kilo or kilo of methamphetamine. I was fascinated at the first Australian methamphetamine conference, where a gentleman from the American Drug Enforcement Agency talked about the international trade and showed photos of a meth lab capable of producing 1 metric tonne per week. So we know that huge amounts of this drug are being produced. And again, the commercial aspects of that are a topic for further discussion. It's fascinating to think who has the skills to produce anything in those quantities. And then if your fairy godmother told you that you'd just been awarded a ton of white powder sitting somewhere in Southeast Asia, how would you manage the challenge of getting it to Australia? If instead your fairy godmother kindly moved it to Port Melbourne and said there's a container sitting on the docks with a ton of methamphetamine sitting in it, who has the skills to take 1,000 kilograms and sell it in milligram quantities in little bags and get paid for it? So that there's a level of organisational skill that sits behind these enterprises. And I guess that's a nice segue to the opioids, where there are similar skills. You may be, or maybe not, surprised to know that one of the largest producers of legal opioids is Extractus Bioscience in Tasmania, who produce the extraordinary quantity of 35 tonnes per day. They're a leading international producer, particularly of thebaine and codeine, from which thebaine is the precursor for oxycodone and other like drugs, and codeine obviously can be used in itself, but it's also a substrate for other opioids. I'd be interested to hear how many of you have seen people with a problem with poppy seed addiction. Some of us have seen a few. Poppy seeds can contain really high levels of morphine and other opioids. Food grade seeds in Australia are supposed to contain less than 20 milligrams per kilogram, as distinct from 2.5 grams per kilogram, which is found in the stuff that's used for producing opioids for pharmaceutical use. Some of you may have heard, if not had experience, of people being accused of having opioid dependence because their urine sample contains opioids. And here is my hint for should you ever have a patient in that position, is that no legal opioids contain thebaine. Thebaine is if I go back, thebaine is one of the major opioids in raw opium or raw opium poppy seeds, and is actually removed during the production of whether it's a legal opioid or, for that matter, heroin. So if someone has a positive UDS for opioids and they are adamant that it's just from their bagels for breakfast, the marker that will get them out of trouble is thebaine. I had a senior military officer approached me a few years ago because his unit had been singled out for random drug testing and leadership by example. He was the first to give a sample, and his was the only one that was positive. It turned out that he was a very keen consumer of poppy seed bagels and poppy seed cake. And of course,
there's a similar story in the chat to let you know, Ed, that you might want to look at. I'll read it out for the benefit of the recording.
Yeah, thanks.
But Chris, actually, have you got a microphone? Do you want to speak to it? Or Chris may or may not have one.
I do, but I also have a mouthful of grapes. It's all right, I've eaten them now. No, we had so I'm up in Orange, so we've got Bloomfield Hospital and the Orange Base Hospital. We had a series of positive opioid UDSs in one of the wards. It was traced back to these people were denying that they'd used any kind of substances, traced back to orange and poppy seed muffins, with the drug and alcohol CNC actually doing an experiment on herself by having a couple of these muffins and then having a positive UDS for opioids. And we're still in the process of convincing administration maybe that's not a good choice for our clients to have that as an option for food.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that annoyed me most about this senior military officer is, in fact, one of the military doctors wrote this up as a case and failed to mention that I'd actually worked it out for him. Anyway, we've had a series of patients over the last few years taking kamini. It's a traditional Indian herbal that is marketed as a safe cure for a whole lot of things, including, of course, pain. And depending on brand and source, it can contain opioid alkaloids. In fact, it can contain raw opium. And so people who are taking Kamini regularly can end up with classic opioid dependence, with all the usual things of tolerance and withdrawal. And I mention it's one of those things that if you had someone from the subcontinent who had unusual symptoms, it's worth asking, because they may not volunteer it. This has popped up out of order, I've noticed, but salvia is a frequently grown ornamental plant in the garden. It actually grows in my garden. The plant itself is related to mint, and it actually looks a bit like mint when it's not in flower. It contains its own unique psychedelic, but it's also active at the opioid receptor. I have yet to come across anybody who's dependent on it, but I've certainly seen people who've had a nasty experience with it. Again, it's widely available for purchase to grow in the garden, but if you make anything from it, then that's a Schedule 9 product. Certainly, recent times had a lot of, when I'm on call for DACUS, I've had a couple of calls about people taking Kratom. It's a plant which grows in the tropics and has a whole lot of alkaloids all of its own, known as metragenine and lots of other variations on that. It acts at the opioid receptor. It's quite a good painkiller, and of course has been used in traditional medicine for pain relief. And there certainly people have told me that it's quite pleasant. It's unlike the angel's trumpet, which gives you a very unpleasant change in mood. Apparently, this is quite soothing and pleasurable. It was suggested at one stage that it might be a treatment for opioid dependence, and that we could prescribe Kratom in some dose and then gradually reduce that as a way of assisting people who are opioid dependent. It is now, of course, scheduled in Schedule 9 and unavailable in Australia. The other plant that was bandied around some years ago for opioid dependence is iboga. It will grow happily in northern parts of Australia. Again, it's one of those plants with lots of alkaloids that are unique to the plant. So one everyone talks about is ibogaine, which has all sorts of interesting effects. It's an SSRI, it's an agonist at the mu receptor, it's a mild stimulant, and it was talked about a lot maybe 10 or 15 years ago as the answer to opioid dependence. I've yet to see an RCT that says that's actually true. But it's not considered as nasty as the others, and it actually sits in Schedule 4. So should you be able to find a product, you could actually write a prescription. In the African and Yemeni communities, there used to be a lot more consumption of cat. I don't know how much it gets into Australia now. It's obviously another herbal with its own set of alkaloids, the cathinones, which are mostly stimulant, although they do have an effect on the opioid receptor as well. Used traditionally in the local communities to suppress appetite in times of need. It used to be that if you came from one of the African communities, you could get an import permit to get your cat, but the department will no longer issue permits, so it's now become a naughty plant. Many people are surprised to find that the water lily has quite nice quantities of apomorphine, particularly in the roots, the rhizomes to be more correct, with other flavonoids. And again, it has been used throughout recorded history, and you can see it stealing from the side of its use in ancient Egypt for its ability to relieve pain. So now the exciting things. Probably the one you don't know is patchouli, which is found in the more arid parts of the country. And as far back as Joseph Banks observed that it was kind of chewed like a local tobacco. And it contains nicotine and related alkaloids in significant numbers, depending where you source it from. Probably not so much a problem in this end of Australia, but it is reported to be an issue in the north. Now, I couldn't talk about plants that affect how you think without talking about ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a decoction brewed from the stems of the Banisteriopsis vine and Psychotria viridis shrub. And this is brewed up to produce a brew which is probably varies from, almost certainly varies from brew to brew, but also from shaman to shaman, depending on where the herbs are harvested. Effectively, they contain large quantities of DMT and a number of alkaloids which behave like monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So taking ayahuasca produces a profound mental state. I won't ask if anybody online has actually tried it. I have been told by people who have that it can be very enlightening. I've also been told that it's associated with absolutely uncontrollable nausea and vomiting and diarrhea. So picking your shaman and picking your plants is probably important. In some parts of the world, there are religious or ceremonial exemptions, so you can have your ayahuasca experience legally. Currently, I'm not aware of anywhere in Australia where that's legal, although if you go online and look for ayahuasca retreats, there are lots available. And DMT isn't only found in the vines of South America. There are several Australian plants which contain significant quantities of DMT. I was much amused a few years ago when I was first researching this area that in the early 2000s, some bureaucrat in the Australian Agriculture Department thought that we should ban all products that contain psychoactives. And then you start looking at the list, and it includes banning the Australian national emblem, and it doesn't look like it's going to make much sense. But there was this kind of thought that we should be ripping out all the plants which contain psychoactives. which would destroy most gardens, really. So there you go. It was 2011. It was later than I thought. So unsurprisingly, that legislation did not go far. Now, because the other vegetable that causes a great deal of interest is psilocybin. Psilocybin is not unique to the magic mushroom itself. It's found in a whole range of mushrooms, but particularly the psilocybe species. And in the same vein, I have to mention LSD, which of course was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in his laboratory in Switzerland. And I'm sure most of you know the story of his first experience of LSD. It's so famous, in fact, that they produced a postage stamp with a somewhat befuddled Hofmann riding down the road. His description is actually amazing if you find his original description. And it's actually surprising he did so well, because it's an interesting era of pharmacology, because when you try something, you want to try a bit. Well, he had 5 milligrams. The active dose of LSD is 1 microgram per kilogram. So 5 milligrams was a huge dose, weight for weight, which I guess shows that it's actually reasonably safe. So in the nature of the stupidity of armed forces, I normally at this point I would say rude things about America and its need to try and control things and people's brains, but I came across this wonderful excerpt from the Imperial War Museums of the British Army trying to find out what would happen if they could sprinkle LSD into the water of the enemy.
Meanwhile, radio communication at the beaches has become difficult, if not impossible. Men with no specific task to perform have relapsed into laughter and inconsequential behavior, though they are still capable of sustained physical effort. This man nearly succeeded in felling this tree using only a spade.
It doesn't get any more sensible. And in the end, the commanding officer called it quits because he actually completely lost control of his troops. Similar alkaloids, and in fact, LSD itself can be extracted from the morning glory vine. I was surprised actually when I started looking at this that there are actually 1,600 species of morning glory, so they don't all look the same. And morning glory seeds are available on the internet, and you can see in that little black box that there's some advice on how many seeds you need to use to have whatever level of trip you would like. So a few seeds gives you a light trip, and obviously the more you have, the more likely you are to have a heavy trip. Now these, I assume some of you will know about it, but I can't help but talk about MK Ultra because it really shows up the stupidity of governments at times. In the 1950s, the American military were aware that some soldiers were returning from captivity in North Korea with significant mental change, and they were obsessed that there must be some substance that might change people's brains. And so, Senator Ted Kennedy actually conducted an inquiry into this almost 25 years later, and showed that the CIA had been paying 30 universities or more to test the various psychedelics to see what use they would have. And one of the silliest stories is that the CIA they had heard that somewhere in Mexico there was this mushroom that altered people's consciousness. They couldn't quite send CIA agents off to climb the hills of Mexico. So they funded Gordon Wasson and his wife to go on a holiday in Mexico and look for mushrooms. Wasson was actually the vice president of the venture capital bank, JP Morgan. His wife was Russian-born, was actually a pediatrician, and she introduced him to the joys of foraging for mushrooms in the forest. And together they became very interested in mushrooms and their roles in society, and they actually called themselves ethnomycologists. So off they went to Mexico looking for the magic mushroom, and they found a very isolated group where the shaman Maria Sabina was prepared to share with Wasson some knowledge of psilocybin. He swore to the death that he would protect her, but in fact he couldn't. His ego got away from him. He agreed to a front page, a cover page of Time Life, covering his exploits in search of the magic mushroom. And in his second book, he actually named Maria Sabina as the source of his information, which was a terrible thing for her and her community. Her own house was burned down by the locals in protest, and of course a whole lot of would-be if they could be's went off to Mexico looking for mushrooms, and the village was overrun. It was actually a disaster. So there's Wasson on the front page of Life magazine. So Wasson came back with some mushroom samples. He sent some samples to a friend in Paris who managed to grow some psilocybin mushrooms on his windowsill. And he in turn sent some of these mushrooms to Albert Hoffman of LSD fame, who managed to isolate psilocybin. This article and other things led Timothy Leary, who was a psychologist at Harvard, to think about the experiments you could do with LSD and psilocybin. So there was some really good research done. I don't want to sound too cynical about the whole thing. The Concord prison experiment recruited 32 inmates for psilocybin-assisted therapy. And they were really optimistic that this would reduce recidivism. And initially it looked like it had, but people who've gone back and revisited the research are much more skeptical about whether it did anything at all. But I assume there were some happy prisoners. One of their more favourite experiments was the Marsh Chapel experiment. So they took 20 divinity students, double blind. Half of them were given psilocybin and half of them were given niacin, which gave them a nice warm flush and and made them feel like something was happening. And fascinatingly, I mean, there were all these discussions about the wonderful experience that these divinity students had over that Easter. About 25 years later, there's a follow-up, and they were still saying that it was the most amazing mystical experience of their life. Unfortunately, Leary, like Wasson, had a big ego. It's also suggested that Leary liked using the psilocybin and LSD in the laboratory himself and sharing it with students and friends. And he really established the sort of drug counterculture, or at least encouraged it in the 60s. So that was his mantra, was tune in, turn on, drop out. This late 60s coincided with conscription for the Vietnam War in America. And Richard Nixon, when he was president, described Leary as the most dangerous man in America. The end result of that is that LSD and psilocybin not only fell into disrepute, but they basically were banned through much of the world. And it's set back research with these things for about 50 years. And it's really only recently that Imperial College in London, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Swinburne have started serious research with the psychedelics. And there's obviously a lot to learn. There for a minute. There are lots of patients will tell you that they microdose psilocybin, that they collect the psilocybin when it's flourishing, and they dry it, and then they have ways of taking little bits regularly, which they say improves their mental state. And of course, I, for one, can't say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just interesting sort of folk wisdom. I know when I was in general practice, I had a young man who was really quite psychotic much of the time, but we had an agreement. He'd been compulsorily treated in a psych hospital around the time of his 21st birthday, which he thought was the worst experience of his whole life. And he agreed that he would come and see me only if I promised not to stick him in hospital unless I needed to save his life. So he was often quite weird when he came to see me. And he came to see me one day, it was quite heightened. And he said he recognised that he was quite heightened. And he thought it was time to do a clearing. And so I said, well, how do you do a clearing? And he said, well, I'm growing some cactus specially. So I somewhat stupidly said, how do you prepare your cactus? And he looked at me like I was completely stupid and said, well, you peel it, of course. How much cactus do you need? And he put his hands out, about 1 metre. So folk wisdom, people are out there using all sorts of plants. I couldn't possibly cover all of them, but I thought it would be enough to start a bit of a discussion and some thinking. When you start thinking about the things people smoke, there is an enormous list. Some of them have kind of folk names and some don't. Most of those are available in Australia. I mean, it never occurred to me that I might want to smoke passion fruit or cloves. But there's a bit of a list for you, and that's by no means exclusive. So there's some great books out there if you want to go look. And I didn't even think about including cacti. I mean, there are so many things which can be used, and of course, you don't know if you don't ask. So some of the it's always worth asking patients, what else do they use? Anyway, I will shut up and hope that I've stirred some of you out of your lethargy in the afternoon and would like to comment on plants. What's your experience with people using plants and fungi and cactuses?
Thanks, Ed. We'll open up to questions and comments. Hopefully this is sort of put in everyone's radar, thinking about vegetables, like you called them at the start, that people might consume with psychoactive effect. I always think about a case I had when I was a registrar of a patient that I was seeing in an opioid pharmacotherapy clinic, and I asked him what he did with his time, and he said that he liked to collect cacti. And then I worked out that he had a peyote cactus after a while, and he acknowledged that he had a nibble of the button sometimes. So it does pop up. But maybe show of hands, has anyone picked up anyone eating a plant, using a plant to get them high? Yep. Krista, do you want to share?
Yep. Thanks. That was really interesting. We had a little cluster from our OTP who were friends in an adjacent town on the mid-north coast who all had some corkwood together. And one of them ended up seemingly acutely psychotic in the ED requiring droperidol. One of his other mates was vomiting so profoundly that he missed 3 days of his Hep C, I think it was treatment, and ended up then stopping taking it because he thought he was failing treatment. And the other one seemed to just have a pleasant time of it.
How do you prepare corkwood?
They smoked it, but the simple answer is I don't know how you're meant to. But I get a little giggle because there's actually Corkwood Road is the road heading into a nearby town. And I was like, don't give people clues.
But the reality is, I mean, there are lots of things around which have medicinal or toxic qualities. I was always interested reading about the Wassons, that they had such expertise that they always got their mushrooms right. Of course, we've had lots of local experience of people who maybe they got their mushrooms right, but for the wrong reasons. So lots of, I mean, it's the age-old question is, why does the cannabis plant have all these interesting alkaloids? And of course, they're insecticidal. They happen to do, I don't know what they do to insects, but humans discovered that some of these insecticidal compounds they find nice. Plants don't waste energy on producing complex compounds unless they have some function. And they're mostly either insecticidal or they cause horrible side effects for the animals that might eat them, other bigger animals than insects. So lots and lots of plants have some sort of chemical defense.
Thanks, Ed. Nicotine's kind of the classic insecticide, isn't it? We'll go to Erin. Oh, you're on mute, Erin.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thanks. That was a really interesting talk. That was really informative. Thank you. And it reminded me of a story, a patient back when I was a med student, and I was doing my first rotation in the psych ward. And this young man came in like completely psychotic. And he told me, he told me that he had started an undergrad degree in chemistry, and then he dropped out and then stole all the uni's chemistry equipment and was distilling something out of black wattle. And he was Yes, couch surfing at his friends' houses, but had set up this black wattle distillery and was really excited. He was so keen to share all of his black wattle experiences with anyone who would listen. And I listened as the med student. And then I went and Googled it on this website called Erowid. And there is a lot of information on black wattle. So yeah, when you mentioned black wattle, that's what it brought back to me.
Yeah, well, DMT, and of course, yeah, Erowid's full of recipes for all sorts of things. That, I mean, it's the kind of, I don't know, encyclopedia of drug use and drug experience, but it includes how to do things. There's lots of recipes for how to prepare things if you.
Yeah.
I haven't actually looked up how to prepare cactus other than peel it.
I'm sure there's something on how to do it on Erowid, but yes, it was very lucky that or maybe unlucky that he did an undergraduate degree in chemistry, because he had the resources to probably.
He could set up his own still.
Yeah. Yep.
And I've certainly had a couple of patients now who've been addicted to poppy seeds, consuming really large quantities. I mean, some kilograms, because you can go to bakery supplies and buy quite large quantities. For legal sale in Australia, they've got to have that sort of less than 20 milligrams per kilogram. So an awful lot of poppy seeds to get high on that, but clearly there's some stuff for sale that's got much more in it than that. And when I was researching poppy seeds for this senior military officer, see if I get him off the hook, it turns out that the opiate concentration in Australian grown poppy seeds is amongst the best in the world. So there you go.
One of our expert champions then. Any other questions, comments? Alison's mentioned that DMT is the commonest she's seen. For the benefit of the recording, Erowid spelled EROWID, that alongside Blue Light and Reddit, three of the good kind of peer education harm reduction resources around, as well as the Drug Users Bible, which is a chunky PDF that has a lot around user experiences and advice on how to use that kind of thing. If anyone wants a copy of that, I've got a PDF of it.
There's lots, and there's some great resources out there. I mean,
yeah.
I didn't talk at all about the history of methamphetamine, but it was first synthesized early in the 20th century. Lots of it produced during the Second World War, and by both sides. Battle of Britain was fought with pilots kept awake on low dose amphetamine, and the Germans produced methamphetamine, which they hoped would keep soldiers awake, particularly on the Russian front. At the end of the war, someone produced Uncle Fester's recipe for methamphetamine. I have no idea who Uncle Fester was, but Uncle Fester's recipe for methamphetamine is out there on the web, should you want to convert your ephedra to methamphetamine.
Yes, practice with trainees here. How should trainees approach their clients, consumers, patients, guests, and inquire about plants that get you high?
Oh, curiosity. It's just being curious. I'm interested in what else you do. When you can't get the good stuff, is there anything else you do? And people often, like Erin's patient, very keen to tell you that they've, all my patient doing is clearing with his meter of cactus, to tell you that they've grown this in their garden. One of my patients proudly told me that out the back of a property which he wouldn't identify. He had one of those polythene growing houses with several strains of marijuana because there was one which was high in CBD, which was good for getting mellow, and there was one which was high in THC, which would get you off your face. And there was an in-betweeny one, and he kept them very separate because he didn't want them to mix the gene lines. And he took his cannabis growing very seriously, as do the commercial guys. It's all automated.
Look out for plant-based hobbies, folks. Alrighty. Any final questions, comments? All right. If everybody wants to join me in thanking Ed for coming out to present on plants that get you high. Did you have an animals that get you high talk, Ed? I can't remember. Or
Yep. Yeah, sucking on cane toads.
yeah, we might do a part 2 at some point if you're interested in that. But yeah, keep an eye out for this. Come back to this presentation because there's lots of stuff here that's a bit novel that you might not have encountered before. And yeah,
Nice.
great to hear everyone's stories. Thanks for putting in that information about Corkwood, Kristen. Yeah, a bit tongue-in-cheek that they've got Corkwood Road.
Yeah, there are lots of interesting rabbit burrows to go